All right. So, like I said, we are talking about energy flow in ecosystems. Energy flow in ecosystems. Ran out of space here. So, when we talk about matter next week in the carbon, phosphorus, all those fun cycles, matter cannot be created or destroyed. But with energy, it's a one-way stream. So, cool. You cool? All right, cool. Energy flows in a one-way stream from primary producers to consumers. You'll talk more about this tomorrow in your hybrid lesson, but essentially, a primary producer is anything that carries out the process of photosynthesis, anything that can get energy from the sun, and a consumer is anything that has to eat or consume something in order to get energy. They can't make their own. So, in ecosystems, energy flows in a one-way stream from primary producers to consumers. It is not recycled. Matter is recycled, energy is not. So, a food chain is just a series of steps I'm gonna, oh no, it's gone. All right. No, I'm going back up, don't worry. A series of steps in which organisms transfer energy by eating or being eaten. So, as energy flows through an ecosystem, through an environment, it starts with our primary producers and makes its way through various consumers until there's no more energy left because it's all used up. A food chain is just a way to illustrate the steps that are taken through that whole energy process, either through eating things or being eaten. When something is eaten, it transfers energy on. When something eats, it is obtaining energy. The whole thing. We always start with our primary producers. So can I like scroll this up? So if we start with our primary producers, let's say we've got our algae, right? That's our primary producer. The algae gets eaten by a flagfish. Flagfish, they're like small little guppy looking fish. Let's say that flagfish gets eaten by a bass. That largemouth bass gets eaten by just like a big bird. And that bird gets eaten by an alligator. So we've got our primary producer. All of our blues are consumers. And this green is a special type of consumer called a herbivore. So all that algae is eaten up by our fish. Our fish are getting eaten by a bigger fish. Bigger fish gets eaten by a bird. Bird gets eaten by a gator. And that is one example of one specific food chain. There's a little hidden piece to this that I want to point out. And that is, along with algae, there is something called a phytoplankton, or a bunch, I guess, of phytoplankton. Phyto plankton. No. My board gets tired by the end of the day. Please. This is why you don't save your recordings till the end of the day. One moment. All right. Now it's fixed. Phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are photosynthetic bacteria that live on and in algae. So, just like we have millions of bacteria living in our digestive tracts and on our skin, algae have a similar system with phytoplankton. Phytoplankton also photosynthesize and make their own energy out of sunlight. So when these flagfish eat the algae, they are also eating the phytoplankton. But a common thread in biology is that everything is always a little bit more complicated than you think it is. So this is not necessarily how eating habits in an ecosystem work. It's a lot more complicated than that. So we have food webs. In a food web, we have a complicated network what's the word I'm looking for? Of all the feeding interactions in an ecosystem. If you're a fan of shorthand, when I got to taking notes in college and I started writing really quickly, interactions quickly became I/A. So if that's something you're interested in, there's a little tidbit for you. So essentially, in a food web, a food chain is just one pathway. So I'll pull one up for you. Wait for you to Get that down. Whoopsies. I'll come back. Just give me a second. All right. So the food web I have up here is a food web containing all of the interactions that lead to the waterbird diet in Chesapeake Bay. It takes a lot of self-control not to sing Chesapeake Bay like they do in Hamilton. So, my cool scroll. So, this is a food web. It's a little bit simplified based on what an actual ecosystem would be, but it's pretty close. So, if we look down here, we have our primary producers. Those are our photosynthetic organisms. We've got our phytoplankton, we've got some vegetation, we've got some more vegetation, and we can track a food chain through a food web. So if we start with our phytoplankton, if it gets eaten by these fish, the fish get eaten by the wading birds. That's a food chain within a food web. We can also say that phytoplankton get eaten by these herbivores, which get eaten by these ducks, which get eaten by the bald eagle. And that's another food chain within the food web. There are a bunch of different ones we can track. But essentially, all of the possible interactions within an ecosystem are labeled here. We've got our primary producers, our herbivores, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. There is one really important step that a lot of food webs leave out, and personally, it is one of my favorite steps. And that is decomposers and detritivores. I personally think decomposers and detritivores are super, super cool. And a step that a lot of people don't really take into consideration because they take place after the top tier of everything, but they also live in the ground. So decomposers convert dead material into detritus. You know how if somebody forgets to rake their lawn right before the first snow of the winter and those piles of leaves just kind of get stuck under the snow and they just kind of rot into this weird sludge that you find at the when the snow starts to thaw. That sludge is kind of like detritus. We've broken down organic material and it's just a bunch of gunk. Animal feces is also considered detritus. Essentially, it's what's left over from organic matter as it starts to decay. Detritivores, so material into detritus, which is eaten by detritivores. So our decomposers are our like fungi and bacteria. Our detritivores are like our worms and mites and all those creepy crawlies. This is a really key step because without decomposers, energy would be trapped. in dead organisms. Not only does it allow us to recycle nutrients, because nutrients do need to be recycled, whatever's left in all of that when an organism dies, it doesn't completely become devoid of energy. Without decomposers, all of the dead matter that has ever died would still be here. It's kind of gross to think about. Without decomposers, everything that has ever died would just be piled up somewhere. We needed that extra step in the food chain to start breaking stuff down, partially because we need to use that energy, and partially because we need to recycle nutrients, which we will talk about in the next couple lessons. Now, we've created a relatively complex system. We've not created, we've observed, nature has created a relatively complex system. What if something happens to that? If a key player is taken out, of a food chain or a food web, the entire thing will destabilize. If a key player is taken out of a food chain or a food web, the entire food chain and food web would crumble. Which is why conservation biologists take biodiversity really, really seriously. I'll give you a second to write it down, and I'll scroll back up to our food web from the Chesapeake Bay. This is why endangered species research is important. This is why whenever a parasite is introduced or an invasive species is introduced to an environment, we are worried about what they're taking up and what they're putting in and taking out of an ecosystem, because while this is really complex, it's really easy to throw off kilter. So I'll come back to this, but let's say that these small fish get taken out by a parasite. Parasite is introduced to the water. Somebody didn't clean their kayak before they went from one lake to another. Introduced a parasite that wiped out those fish. These birds, these fish, gone. Their main diet's gone. And the osprey is gone too. Or it had to find other ways of eating. We'll say that the osprey started feeding on the ducks because they didn't have fish to eat on anymore. And then now that the bald eagles can't eat ducks, they're gone. All the while, there's nothing to eat these zooplankton, and those numbers increase. And they take over the ecosystem, and the whole thing is thrown off. That's why ecologists spend a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of energy researching and creating food webs and food chains, because they want to know if something is starting to happen. If a certain animal is starting to die or overgrow, what they can do to help balance this out so we don't lose species as a whole. There's another concept that we're going to talk about. And that is the concept of trophic levels. If I were you, I'd make a little highlight, underline, exclamation point in your notes about trophic levels. They're pretty important. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I'd know about trophic levels. Each step in a food chain or a food web is a trophic level. Each step in a food chain or web. So the first trophic level is always our primary producers. Our first step is always our primary producers. We can't get energy any other way. We can't kick this process off in any other way. Trophic levels can be illustrated in something called an ecological pyramid. I'll give you time to write this, and then I will draw one out for you. So, each step in a food chain or a food web is called a trophic level. Our first trophic level is always our primary producers, and we can illustrate trophic levels and the energy that flows between them with an ecological pyramid. So, cool. Got it. Got it. All right. Ooh, I lost it. Oh no. Is this us? Yes. Okay. I do the same thing 3 times a day, so sometimes I accidentally click on the wrong one. An ecological pyramid. We're just gonna draw a big old triangle. That's a bad triangle. There we go. It's a little bit better. Goodness gracious. Okay. There's our pyramid. At the very, very bottom, we have our primary producers. Primary producers have 100% of the energy that they obtain. So we got a bunch of energy from the sun, yes, but of the usable energy in each trophic level, primary producers get 100% of it. When we eat our plants, when we get to this, after our primary producers, we get to our primary consumers. Our primary consumers get 10% of the energy that plants had, or bacteria, our primary producers. The rest is lost as heat. That other 90% is lost as heat. Now I say heat, but so when we move, right, that takes energy. That any movement is essentially kinetic energy. So movement is kinetic energy, which is just fancy heat. So 90% of what those plants make is lost or used up, and 10% makes it to the next level. We then have our secondary consumers. They get about 1% of the energy from the plants, or 10% of that 10%. The rest, you guessed it, is lost as heat. And we get our tertiary consumers. And our tertiary consumers get about 0.1%. The rest is lost as heat. So, out of all of the energy that plants make, our tertiary consumers only get about 1.1% of it. So we'll write this out in words once y'all get it written down. So, ecological pyramids show us the relative energy level in each trophic level. Because on average, about 10% of the usable energy in each trophic level is transferred to the next. So if you're a word definition person, this tells us the same information as our diagram above. You're almost there. There is something else these ecological pyramids can show us, or measure, I guess, and that is something called biomass. Biomass, all one word. We break it down: bio, life, mass, matter, the amount of matter that is in living things. Biomass is the total amount of living tissue in a trophic level. So, if we as humans are in our trophic level, right, we could take all of us, dehydrate us, weigh us, and measure how much biomass is in our trophic level. It is typically measured in grams of organic matter per unit area. So the total amount of organic matter per square foot, square inch, square mile, square kilometer, usually kilometer because biologists like the metric system. Scientists in general like the metric system. So we, like this, because the amount of biomass each trophic level can support is partially determined by the energy available. If you think about how much living tissue exists in a desert, right? Some, but not a heck of a lot. And you think about how much living tissue is in a rainforest, count up all those trees and plants, that's a lot. So the energy available in the first trophic level, the very first one with our primary producers, is relatively low in a desert, right? There's not a heck of a lot of green. But in a rainforest, the amount of primary producers is outrageous. So the amount of biomass that can be supported in a desert is way lower than in a rainforest because the amount of energy that is available in a desert is way lower. This can be illustrated by a biomass pyramid. I will not draw one for you because it's essentially the same thing, but instead of energy percentages, it's weight. But there is also something called a pyramid of numbers. Essentially, ecologists like to organize things into pyramids. So, a pyramid of numbers shows the number of individuals in each trophic level. So, we've got a pyramid right here. Say we've got 40 tomato plants. Those 40 tomato plants get eaten up by tomato worms. Have you ever seen a tomato worm? They're really cool. I'll show you in a minute. Those tomato plants get eaten up by 20 tomato worms. All of those 20 tomato worms, that feeds about 2 birds. And both of those birds are eaten by 1 fox. So this could be, if these were weights, so if we had like 40 pounds of tomato plants, 5 pounds of tomato worms, that would be considered a biomass pyramid. We could also do it through individuals. So of our 40 tomato plants, that can support 20 worms. Those 20 worms can support 2 birds. Those 2 birds can support 1 fox. I'm going to show you tomato worms because I went on a little tangent. And I think they're super cool. They're technically called hornworms, but colloquially are called tomato worms. And they look like this. Isn't that cool looking? I love biology. That thing is actually a caterpillar. It will grow up to be a moth. And instead of having like cocoons that like hang off of the tomato plants, they just fall off the tomato plants and get buried in the dirt, stay there all winter, and then emerge as a moth. I think it's so cool. But yeah, no, so that is a pyramid of numbers. Each little section is considered a trophic level. So the plants are in a trophic level, the worms are in a trophic level, the birds are in a trophic level, and the fox is in a trophic level. Anybody have any questions?